So what's the main purpose for your visit to New Zealand?
We're doing several things. Tear Fund New Zealand invited me to help show the film With God on Our Side. It's a film that introduces the situation in Israel-Palestine, introduces us to the church in Israel, Palestine, and the struggles they face to exist and continue to flourish. And so we're showing the film in various venues. And I've been invited to give some lectures in various colleges and institutions looking at the Bible, Israel, and the church. What does the Bible have to say about our responsibility to the Jewish people and to the gospel?
Let me address some of the accusations to you that people have made against you. Do you deny the Holocaust?
Not at all. I've visited Auschwitz numerous occasions, one of the Holocaust museums in one of the camps. The Holocaust was an evil act. I mean, Hitler was a terrible person. The Holocaust is a fact of history. I think that we must repudiate those who deny the Holocaust.
Are you anti-Semitic?
I don't believe so. Anti-Semitism is a form of racism. Racism is a sin for Christians. We should treat everyone the same. We're all created in the image of God, and to denigrate one people group because of their race or their origins is evil. So I don't regard myself as anti-Semitic. I think we need to distinguish between criticizing a political system as racist and racism. Yep. You know, anti-Semitism is a form of racism. And a number of rabbis have come to my defense recently. Rabbi Dankon Sherbok is a well-known international expert on anti-Semitism. He's written 3 books on anti-Semitism. He's served as a Crown prosecution witness for the British government in trials of anti-Semites. If you go on my website, you'll see a letter from him repudiating any hint that I'm anti-Semitic.
Mm-hmm. Has there been a police action against you for anti-Semitism? This has been reported by some. Is that the case? Is that still the case?
The Council of Christians and Jews is a very respected organisation in Britain, bringing Jews and Christians together. They received some complaints about me from some of my antagonists, my critics, and they submitted that information to the British police, who investigated those allegations and concluded there was no criminal behaviour on my part whatsoever. Mm-hmm. They exonerated me of that.
So there's no ongoing police
No
action?
ongoing investigation, not at all.
There's a very famous photograph of you hugging Yasser Arafat. How did that come about? What was your relationship with Arafat? Some are saying you're a friend of terrorists.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
Well, I'll deal with the last comment first and then go back to the link with Yasser Arafat. Israel, in the eyes of many Jewish academics, is practicing a form of apartheid. It's ethnically cleansing the Palestinians from the occupied territories. Its behavior is totally unacceptable in the international community. Now, if you are a Zionist and you're trying to justify what Israel's doing in Palestine, how are you going to win the PR argument with such an appalling record of human rights abuses? I mean, the DCI, the Defense of Children International, records a number of children in administrative detention in Israeli jails, so between 50 and 300 at any one time, under isolated administrative detention. These are kids, children, in Israeli prisons, Palestinian children, which is in breach of international law. How do you defend that? Well, if you don't like the message, you shoot the messenger. It's as simple as that. You denigrate, you seek to deny or destroy the integrity of your critics. And so regularly I'm accused of a range of unsavory activities to deflect attention from the message which we're giving, which is we want to see justice, peace, and reconciliation between Israel and the Palestinians. We're committed to non-violent resistance to that occupation, and we want to see a peaceful settlement based on the rule of international law. The position of the New Zealand government, position of the British government, the UN, United States. So we're hardly radical in that regard. Mm-hmm. Now, as Christians, we're called to be ambassadors. What's an ambassador do? An ambassador represents his government on foreign soil. We're called to be ambassadors for Jesus, which means I will go anywhere and meet anyone to be an ambassador for Jesus. That particular occasion, it's my photo, it's on my website, so it's hardly something someone's dredged up. We were at a Christian conference in Jerusalem, 300 or 400 Christians from around the world. We were invited to go and visit the Palestinian government buildings in Ramallah, which the Israelis had bombed a few weeks before, and we had an opportunity to meet Yasser Arafat and some of the other leaders of the Palestinian administration. At that time, Arafat, along with his leadership, had repudiated violence. They had entered the political realm, negotiating with the Israeli leaders. The Oslo Peace Accord had been signed on the White House lawn. He'd shaken hands with Israeli leaders. Did that make them terrorists too? We repudiate terrorism, we repudiate violence, but we're willing to meet anyone, anywhere, to bring the gospel message to bear.
When you met with Arafat, did you have a chance to share with him about the gospel of Jesus?
Not at all. There were 200 or 300 of us. We were queuing up to have our pictures taken with the guy, so I have no personal link with the guy. But on other occasions I have. I've been to Iran, I've been to Lebanon, I've met with leaders of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, had a half-an-hour meeting with one of the leaders there, and the last question he asked me was, Stephen, what would you advise Hezbollah? I said, release the Israeli hostages. Let them go. I said, you've beaten the Israelis. They've had to leave southern Lebanon. Show that you are magnanimous. Show that you worship a compassionate God. I felt that was a Christian thing to say.
Leaders of Hezbollah, they're interested in you. Why? How is it you've come to their attention?
I think it's because my books have been translated into Arabic and Farsi. Our books deal with the Arab-Israeli conflict from a Christian perspective, and they deconstruct British imperialism, British colonialism in the Middle East, American imperialism, and rightly or wrongly, many Muslims around the world look at Christianity, they look at American foreign policy, and they equate the two. They assume that the West is in the Middle East to colonize the land, to take it away from the indigenous peoples, just as we did in the Crusades. And so one of our responsibilities is to help them understand that this is not biblical Christianity, that the use of the Bible to further a political agenda is inappropriate, it's wrong. And so what we're doing is helping Muslims especially go back to the teaching of Jesus and present a more accurate picture of the Christian faith that's apolitical, and deconstruct the way Britain and America particularly have used the Bible to justify their colonization of the Middle East.
On a website, Stephen, you're accused of encouraging people to go to a site called The Ugly Truth without any warning, apology or qualification, we're told. And moreover, on your website, we're told that there is a gallery of photographs of Israeli soldiers entitled Herod's Soldiers Operating in Bethlehem Today, which encourages an anti-Semitic view that all Jewish people are Christ killers. How do you respond to that sort of criticism of your website and of your use of Facebook?
Right. Well, let's deal with Facebook first. Facebook is meant to be for your friends. It's a way of communicating with people who want to be your friends. I put stuff on my Facebook every day. Good articles I think my friends would find of interest. 5 or 6 a day. And back in October last year, someone sent me an article by Ray McGovern. He'd published in Consortium News. It's available on hundreds of websites, and it's an article about the possibility that Israel would attack Iran, preemptive strike against Iran to stop them developing nuclear weapons. It's a good article, historically accurate, factual, no criticism of the article whatsoever. The mistake I made was I put that article on my website, but the link was to this particular website that you mentioned. It's on hundreds of websites, and the guy who sent it to me actually sent it from that one. I didn't bother looking at the website. I was just interested in the article. I was inviting my friends to read the article. I was not promoting the website. When someone pointed out to me that there was material on that website that was unedifying, that was anti-Semitic, I took it off straight away. That was in January. But a number of guys wrote to my bishop back in November, December, saying I should be sacked for putting this link on. I get criticisms every week. But when they harass me, when they defame me, I don't read them any more than anonymous critics. What these guys did was they wrote to all my staff and told them to read their article about me. And if they'd written to me personally, I'd have taken it seriously, but they wrote to my staff. That's devious. It's underhand. In terms of your second
the photograph.
Comment, I take photos all the time. It's my favorite hobby. It's about 25,000 photos on my website. But what they're doing is called data mining. data mining. They trawl my website, other websites, things I say, things I do, this kind of appearance. They will be monitoring this program. They will find a sentence in the middle of it. They will take it out of context, twist it, and use it to further their agenda. That particular occasion, there were photos I took of Israeli soldiers that were impeding a democratic, non-violent demonstration where someone's home was, the barrier was going up, the separation barrier was going up through their land, stealing their land, and we wanted to support this Christian family. The soldiers wouldn't let us through. They fired sand bombs at us, and I took photos of the soldiers, and I simply subtitled Herod's soldiers. When someone criticized that, I replaced it with Bibi's soldiers. So I respond to criticism when it's directed to me and it's constructive and helpful.
What would you like to say to Jewish people who perceive you to be an enemy of Israel or an enemy to Jews? What would you say to them?
I would say, first of all, listen to Jewish people who know me well. I take those who know me well much more seriously than those who don't, who say things about me where they don't know me. I've said on more than one occasion, I'm more than willing to meet with Jewish leaders, Jewish people who want to talk through, and as we're doing today, and answer their questions or their criticisms. And I do that when I can. But I use as a barometer my Jewish friends who know me well, who give me constructive feedback. We work together. I'm a patron of a Jewish organization, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. My longest and one of my closest friends, Mike Lawson, is Jewish. His family, he lost family in Auschwitz. I've known him for 35, 40 years. He said recently, if Stephen Sizer had a whiff of anti-Semitism about him, he would not be my friend. Leading Jewish rabbis, friends of mine, we speak often at conferences together, and they're my barometer. I think we do need to draw a distinction between criticizing a political system and denigrating a people. That is sin, that is evil, and I repudiate anti-Semitism unequivocally.
Have you made mistakes? Do you have regrets? Is there anything you'd like to change that could have been done better in the public persona of you?
All the time, all the time. I'm sure we'll think back, I wish I'd said that differently in this interview. But we're sinners, but the question is, are we saved by grace? And are we seeking to follow Jesus? Are we seeking to serve him? And I want Jesus to be honored, and I'm pleased to be able to be here and engage with you here at Laidlaw too.
So, for people who find they're hostile toward you, who feel you're an enemy, do you want to explain anything again by way of apology or regret? Is there anything particularly that you could have changed that you would like to change in the past?
Well, I've put in print the things that I really do believe, and I would encourage folk to read what I've actually said and not what people have said about me. My book, Christian Zionism Roadmap to Armageddon, was my PhD thesis, and it traces the historical roots of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the theological agenda of Christian Zionists, and their political actions today, which are deeply troubling. I mean, you take someone like John Hagee, for example. Hagee, he's pastor of Cornerstone, San Antonio, Texas. He said recently the United States must join Israel in a preemptive military strike against Iran to fulfill Bible prophecy and speed the return of Christ. Now, if that isn't incitement to hatred, I don't know what is. But we repudiate that. My second book is the one that I find I'm promoting more and more, because it deals with the relationship between Israel and the church and the Bible. And the question I really want to push is, was the coming of Jesus the fulfillment or the postponement of the promises God made to Abraham? Because God has only ever had one plan, and that plan is through Jesus. And if there's one thing that people could read that would help them get a feel for where I'm coming from, it would be this book, Zion's Christian Soldiers. I commend that. And the film, With God on Our Side, which I helped to produce, which is available on Amazon, With God on Our Side.
People use the term replacement theology quite a lot. An accusation against you, against other theologians who it's claimed don't see Israel as still part of God's story, that there has been a replacement of Israel by the church. Can you give us a simple, I guess, summary of what you think that term replacement theology means, and then answer the question, are you a replacement theologian?
Replacement theology is a word used by critics of the position we're coming from that suggests that we believe that the church has replaced Israel, so that there is no place for Jewish people in God's purposes in the future. The Old Testament was about Israel, the New Testament's about the church, and in history that view has led to antagonism and hostility toward Jewish people. It was certainly true in the Reformation and subsequently. Christians quite wrongly denigrated Jews and targeted Jews, and that was evil, that was wrong. I'm not a replacement theologian. I don't believe the church has replaced Israel. I believe the church is Israel. And I can unpack that. The scriptures teach quite plainly that God's people, through history, through the time of the Old Testament into the New Testament, was always inclusive of people of other races. The Bible never teaches that Israel as a term is defined by a racial group descended from Abraham. In the time of Esther, for example, it says many other nationalities became Jews. Esther 8 verse 17. Psalm 87 talks about the nations around Israel being given citizenship. This one was born in Zion, says David, on the basis of faith, not race. So God's people in the Hebrew Scriptures was always inclusive of other nationalities on the basis of faith. That's why God says in the Psalms, "My house will be a house of prayer for all nations." It was never meant to be for one people. So when we come to the New Testament, what do we find? Yes, Jesus' disciples were all Jews. There were 12 apostles were Jews. But the good news of the message of Jesus was for all nations, and they were told to go to the whole world. So we see in the New Testament God's people multi-ethnic, and the same in the Hebrew Scripture. So God's only ever had one people, one way to heaven through Jesus. So it's not a replacement theology we're promoting, but a fulfillment theology. Jesus fulfilled many of the promises God made to Abraham, to Moses, and his people in the Old Testament. And it's through Jesus that we are the inheritors of those promises.
What is the future for Israel? When you look forward to the return of Christ, how do you think about the future for Israel?
Well, I have two answers to that, a biblical, theological one and a political one. At the political level, I defend Israel's right to exist under international law with internationally recognized borders. The problem is Israel is the only country in the world that's never defined its borders. It wants recognition, but it won't tell us what it wants to be recognized as. It's got to be agreed with its neighbors, with Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and the Palestinians. And until that takes place, there will be no peace. And it's no good supporting one side or the other unconditionally. You know, one side wants to drive the Jews into the sea, the other side wants to drive the Palestinians into the desert. Civil society, international community has got to resist those two extremes and find a way forward for Jews and Palestinians to live in peace. So I defend Israel's right to exist, but I also defend Palestinians' right to exist as a state. So that's politics. We've got to be pragmatic, use diplomatic, non-violent means of resolving the conflict. And that's where the United Nations plays a very important part. Theologically, I have a different answer. God's people, as I've said, are identified on the basis of faith, not race. Yes, there's a place for Jewish people in God's purposes in the end times, but it's only through Jesus. God's people made of all nations, including the Jewish people. So, for example, in the book of Romans, it talks about God regrafting in the natural branches. Gentiles like myself, we're the wild branches. And God says he can regraft in the natural branches. But it will only be through faith in Jesus, not because they're the children of Abraham, or because they've been circumcised, or they keep the law. It's only through Jesus. But it begs the question, if I'm a Gentile, and I've been grafted into what have I been grafted? It's Israel. There's one people of God. So there's a place for Jewish people in God's purposes. But it's only as we live out the good news of Jesus in our words and our deeds that they're going to be interested.
Would you characterise yourself as an evangelical theologian or an evangelical Christian? And if so, what do you understand the gospel to be?
I was led to Christ through the ministry of Campus Crusade for Christ at university. I was raised in a rather liberal church as a child. I came to faith at university. I served as an evangelist for 4 years with Campus Crusade as a staff person, and then I trained for the Anglican ministry about 35 years ago, and I identify myself as a conservative evangelical. Jesus is central to my theology. The Bible is the inspired Word of God, and my priority is to proclaim Christ in word and deed, and to be an ambassador for Him wherever He sends me. So for me, the gospel is God loves us and created us to know Him in Jesus, but we have all gone our own way. We've sinned. We're separated from God because of our sin, and it's only through Jesus' death in our place and His resurrection that we can know our sins are forgiven and have assurance of eternal life. But we must receive Him. We must believe in Him, trust in Him, and follow Him for that good news to be made personal to us.
What legacy do you want to leave when people think of Stephen Sizer in years to come, perhaps in New Zealand after this visit and perhaps future visits? What do you really want to leave as your legacy to the Christian church, to the Israel debates, to the Middle East debates? What's your legacy? What would you like it to be?
I certainly don't want people to be focusing on the Arab-Israeli conflict and controversy. I want people to be thinking about Jesus and the Bible and making sense of God's will for the Jews and the Palestinians and the Middle East today. I'm here because I want to advocate for the church in Israel-Palestine that does not have a voice, is hemorrhaging, and is close to extinction. Yes, there are Islamist groups that want to expel the Christians, but largely the Arab-Israeli conflict and the plight of the church in the Middle East is threatened more by Western Christian support for Israel than it is from the Islamic world. So what do I want my legacy to be? Well, in the film With God on Our Side, the last 1 minute 45 seconds is me telling the story of the Good Samaritan, and we took that out, and that little video clip is on my website. And I've said before that if the only sermon I'm ever remembered by is this one, that would fulfill me. In the story of the Good Samaritan, first of all, the word good doesn't appear in the story, so we've already interpreted it. He was a neighbor. Not a good neighbor, he was just a neighbor, and if we're not like him, we're not neighbors. But in the story, everyone knows it, most Christians know the story quite well. Jesus is asked the question, who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells a story about a guy who gets going down the road from Jericho to Jerusalem. He gets beaten up by robbers, and they steal his belongings. And then down comes, along that road, becomes a priest, then a Levite, and they both ignore the guy. They walk by on the other side. And then Jesus says, along comes a Samaritan. He stops, he helps the guy, and he takes him to an inn, and he provides for him. And we all think, well, that's the story. It's about a Samaritan who cared for a Jew, and we've got to do the same. That's not what the story's about. In the middle of the story, Jesus put a little additional bit of information that created the dilemma for everyone who came down that road. Jesus says the guy in the road was stripped of his clothes, and they beat him up and left him half dead. So he was unconscious and he was naked. That created the dilemma for anyone who came down that road. That created the dilemma for the guy who asked the question, because no one could tell who he was. They couldn't tell from his dress or from his accent whether he's one of us or whether he's one of them. Jesus reduced the guy to the status of a human being. And the question is, are you going to help someone who's a human being? Not one of our side, not one of their side, the enemy or the good guys. He's a human being. Are you going to stop? That was the dilemma. And who stops? It's one of the enemy. He stops. And when Jesus throws it back to the religious leader who asked the question, he says, which of the three was a good neighbor? And the guy can't bring himself to say the Samaritan. He said the one who had mercy on him. Yeah. And Jesus says, go and do the same. That's our responsibility, to treat everyone we meet as a human being created in the image of God for whom Christ died. And I'd go one stage further than that, and I'd say that we need to treat everyone we meet as if we were meeting Jesus? Would we treat them differently if it was Jesus? If we would, then we should. We should leave people blessed by our conversation, by our encounter, wanting to know more about God, know more about His purposes for their lives. And that's my motive in being here.
Stephen, thanks for talking to us today.
Thank you.